I will call this meeting to order. It's the regularly scheduled meeting of the Transportation Public Works Committee. This day, October 24th, 2017. I'm Councilmember Reich. I chair the committee, and I'm joined by my colleagues on the committee, Councilmembers Yang, Glidden, Palmisano, Bender, and Gordon. We're full complement, and we'll proceed with today's agenda, of which we have 11 items. We have several on consent. I will go through them first. Any committee member can pull them if they wish for further consideration. Starting with item number 3, the contract amendment with PCI Roads, LLC for Northtown Yard Water Main Tunnel Renovation Project. Item 4 is the cooperative agreement with the Hennepin County for a pedestrian crossing study. Series of actions there to proceed. Item 5 is the Downtown Minneapolis Transportation Management Organization grant agreements. Item 6 is the Northern Lights Express Joint Powers Agreement Amendment and cost participation. Item 7 is the Mid-City Industrial Reconstruction Project. Item 8 is the exchange of property rights with Hennepin County for 1101 3rd Avenue South with Hennepin County. And the final item is 2017 Minneapolis Open Streets. And that's approving the 8th Open Street event in 2017 to be held along Nicollet Mall, 5th Street South and Grant Street, and then Grant Street to Loring Park from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. December 16, 2017. Any conversation on these items? Seeing none, I will move all items as submitted. All in favor say aye. Aye. Dissenting nay. Those are approved. We can now move to the public hearing portion of the agenda, starting with item 1, which is the water sewer service line repair assessments. Good morning, Director.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Our first item is the passage of a resolution adopting assessments and levying the assessments for both water and sewer service line repairs. We have a short introductory statement from Brad Blackhawk, who will introduce the item.
Chairman Reich and members of the committee, my name is Bradley Blackhawk, supervisor over in Public Works Utility Connections and Permits, working very closely with the water department as well. We're here to hold public hearing on water and sewer service line repairs in section 509.465 of the Minneapolis Code of Ordinance provides a procedure whereby property owner in need of repair or replacement of a private water or sewer service line may request and authorize the city of Minneapolis to do the necessary work, with the property owner having the option of either paying directly through a bill or paying through a special assessment being added to the real estate taxes. The same section 509.465 of the Minneapolis Code of Ordinance further provides a procedure whereby the city may correct a faulty water service line upon the failure of the owner to do so or agree to do so. If the bill for the corrective work is not paid, the cost may be recovered through the special assessment procedure of section 509.465 of the Minneapolis Code of Ordinances. Our recommendation here today is the passage of a resolution adopting the assessments, levying the assessments, and adopting the assessment rules for water and sewer service line repairs or replacements on the lists of properties as on file with the City Engineer Special Assessment Office.
Thank you. Any questions per the presentation by staff? Seeing none, I will open the public hearing. It's a public hearing for number 1. No one signed in. Anyone wish to come forward? Seeing none, I will close the public hearing and move the following. I will move what we have before us and move approval of the resolution adopting the assessments for the sewer and water service line repairs with the extension of the assessment payments from 5 to 10 years for the following properties: 4218 Emerson Avenue North, 3701 Chicago Avenue, and 5449 27th Avenue South. Any discussion on that motion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Dissenting nay. That carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we go to item 2, the responsibilities for the position of Director of Public Works and the City Engineer ordinances.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Brett Jelly will be introducing this topic and making a short presentation about it. This item is a substantial cleanup item to make the ordinance consistent with the structure of Public Works as it has been for the last numerous years. And this project has been a very long-term project on the part of the team. A lot of hard work has gone into it, and today is somewhat of a milestone, and I'm pleased to have Brett here to present the work.
Good morning, Brett.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, committee members. My name is Brett Jelly. I'm the Director of Business Administration for the Public Works Department. I am here this morning to introduce and recommend approval of ordinance changes related to the responsibilities of the Public Works Director and the City Engineer. Prior to 2006, the city's charter and ordinances considered the Director of Public Works and the City Engineer to be a combined position, and this combined position was the head of the department. In 2006, the City Council amended the charter to separate these roles and establish the Director of Public Works as the department head. For the review of the city ordinances, a team including representatives from Public Works, Human Resources, the City Attorney's Office, identified and reviewed over 50 ordinance sections and over 350 individual ordinance citations that referenced either the Public Works Director or the City Engineer. Each reference was reviewed to determine if the responsibility was related to leadership and management of the department or was primarily technical. If it was related to leadership and management of the department, the responsibility was assigned to the Director of Public Works. If the responsibility was primarily technical, it was assigned to the City Engineer. As I said, over 350 individual citations were reviewed, and after going through this analysis, we are recommending about 70 ordinance citations be amended today. All of the recommended changes are focused on defining these two roles, and outside of the responsibilities of the two positions, the recommended changes are non-substantive in nature. I have one short example to kind of illustrate what the result of this process was. In Title V relating to the building code, there is a 93.60, which states a permit may be granted by the city engineer to place building material on the street. This is a responsibility of the department head and is non-technical in nature, so the ordinance will be changed to assign the duty to the Public Works Director. Also within the building code, there is a provision relating to, quote, additional precautions. Very ominous sounding. This ordinance exists to give the Director of Inspections and the city engineer the latitude to deviate from the building code if there is a compelling safety concern during construction or demolition. Since this is a technical evaluation, the ordinance review team left it with the city engineer, and the ordinance will remain as is. This concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions per the presentation by staff? Seeing none, I will open the public hearing. No one has signed in. Does anyone wish to come forward and make comment? Anyone wish to come forward? Seeing none, I will close the public hearing and note that when this was introduced, it was about 3 or 4 pages long, and it's now compressed into one concise action before us. But I think the director alluded to the work that went into it. When you work on something for 10 years, it's pretty monumental stuff, and it's a big shift, but it's appropriate, and it's the right time. I think it's the right time in the sense that we've shifted our department internally to be very planful and forward-looking, and that actual internal structural thing, I think, is a great basis and complement to what we're doing today at the top. So with that, any further conversation? Seeing none, all in approval say aye.
Aye.
Dissenting name. Thank you. We now can go to the last 2 items that are in the discussion section of the agenda, starting with item 10, the Municipal Fleet Electric Vehicle Study.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, again, I'm going to introduce Brett Jelly, Director of Business Administration, to present the findings of an electric vehicle study last fall. We were given direction by the City Council to complete a targeted study to that would be necessary in order to take the next steps to green our fleet through the use of electric vehicles. The study team has been working for the last 9 months or so, 8 or 9 months, and the result is being presented to you today in these study results. We begin. We have our technical consultants with us as well, and I will say from my own part that I've been very pleased with the thoroughness of this study and the usability of the results that have been presented to us.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. I'm still Brett Jelly, Director of Business Administration for the Public Works Department. Thank you for the opportunity to present this receive and file item on electric vehicle study for our city fleet. Quick overview of the presentation. I'll talk a little bit more in detail on the staff direction, give some background and overview of our city fleet and the current market, and then I'll hand off the presentation to get into the technical study details to Dan Nelson of AECom, who can present their work. During the 2017 budget process, we were directed by City Council to report back to the Council on the benefits, feasibility, reasonable exceptions, cost-benefit analysis, various alternatives, and a recommended approach for eliminating fossil fuels in the city fleet. This was a well-timed direction. Public Works and the Fleet Division manage the fleet for all city vehicles, including Public Works Department, Police Department, Fire Department, and so on. We have considerable experience in purchasing and managing hybrid vehicles. We've been doing that for quite a while. We've also tried a few electric vehicles. 10 years ago, we started testing things on a very targeted basis as vehicles came to market to see how feasible they were. In many ways, the Chevy Bolt, which is highlighted in multiple places in this presentation, is the thing that's changed the game a little bit from a municipal fleet perspective. For any vehicle to be successful in our city fleet, it needs to be practical from a usability standpoint. It needs to be practical from our employees' standpoint, and we also need vehicles that we can afford to purchase and operate. And the Chevy Bolt really took the electric vehicle marketplace forward considerably in those areas. It has the range and performance of a vehicle that can work in our fleet. It meets the employee comfort and practicality of daily use. And the cost premium for the Chevy Bolt is, while still more expensive than what we have in our fleet, that delta continues to shrink. The direction also fits with other adopted city policies. The 2013 Climate Action Plan includes a greenhouse gas emission reduction goal, and living within that Climate Action Plan is the city Green Fleets policy, which was adopted in 2011. The stated goal of this policy is to minimize greenhouse gas emissions of current and future fleet vehicles. And as you can see from the chart, we're seeing some positive trends in greenhouse gas emissions by managing the fleet size, by educating staff on eco-driving best practices, that includes idling, and replacing existing vehicles with fuel-efficient and alternative fuel vehicles. This slide shows the broad categories of vehicles in our city fleet, kind of the three big buckets: light-duty vehicles, heavy-duty vehicles, and non-road vehicles. This is the other part in this chart breaks those categories down further to sedans and SUV minivans, light pickup trucks, and the light duty, and so on. It also indicates in the bottom row of this chart where the EV industry is with producing these types of vehicles. You can see the smaller vehicles are available in the marketplace, and then as you get into the larger vehicle categories, they're in the development and testing phases of the product cycle. A similar chart that adds the number of vehicles within each category and also gives a typical example within that group. One thing to note, this is a rapidly developing marketplace. Even during the process of creating this report, John Sharpville, like a director of fleet, would be sending emails about recent changes or things that were coming to market. So even while we were working on this report, Volvo unveiled a concept electric excavator. You can see it on YouTube. It's pretty cool. Again, that's a concept at this point. And Cummins revealed a Class 7 concept electric semi. Those types of vehicles, while really fun to watch on YouTube, they are a little further out. You see countries, European countries that are a little further ahead of the United States on electric vehicles, setting goals of 2030 and 2040 for converting completely to electric or banning the sale of internal combustion engines. So the time frame to fully convert is out there a ways. So with that background of our fleet, I'm going to introduce Dan Nelson of AECOM to go through their more detailed analysis and scenario planning.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Reich and members of the committee. My name is Dan Nelson. I'm a consultant with AECOM, and we worked with the City of Minneapolis this past year to develop the report that's been prepared, and the slides will go over here. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present on this today. So the slides I'll go through here, I'll give a little bit of background on some of the terminology that we'll go over that helped guide our report before getting into the approach we followed and some of the outcomes that we'll present in some graphs later on in the presentation here. So I'll start off here with some key benefit and cost terms to cover that kind of guided our evaluation and our recommendations here. Maintenance savings is defined in terms of the parts and labor for maintaining an entire vehicle fleet that would, over the coming years, include electric vehicles and electric charging infrastructure. So there are maintenance savings because electric vehicles have a lot fewer moving parts to them than traditional vehicles do. We'll get into that a little bit later. Fuel savings is, again, a savings to the entire vehicle fleet with electric vehicles coming into them. So that includes gasoline and biodiesel reductions, and also factors in electricity purchases to account for those electric vehicles. And CO2 reduction as well. We calculated the metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions reduced from business as usual, or BAU. That's the term that you'll see on some other slides here. So, and a business as usual condition is just continuing to purchase the same vehicles over time. So we'll show that later on. Cost terminology here at the bottom. Total capital cost includes the cost of purchasing the vehicles and charging stations. O&M costs is the total 10-year life cycle cost for fuel and maintenance of the fleet, and then life cycle cost at the bottom is just the sum of those two costs. So two other terms here to present here before I get into it. Net present value is a key measure we used that factors into account both the benefits and the costs when we're looking at it into one single measure. So it was calculated across the 10-year time frame that we considered for the report, and we also show a few different discount rates as well. That just helps to capture the time value of money over our 10-year time frame. It's similar to how an interest rate might be looked at in purchasing terms. And the other term at the bottom here is cost effectiveness. This is defined in terms of the cost to save 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide by integrating electric vehicles into the city's fleet for each of the scenarios that we'll present in the report. And speaking of the scenarios, I'll get into them a little bit here. As I noted earlier, we considered a 10-year time frame for this study from 2018 through 2027. In working with the Fleet Services Division, we learned a lot about their current model for vehicle purchasing. So our recommendations on electric vehicle purchases over the next 10 years are made to fit within that current model. We utilize data on planned vehicle replacements over future years for different city departments so that our recommendations for electric vehicle purchases wouldn't exceed the planned number of internal combustion engine vehicle replacements. That's where the ICE acronym comes in there. So when you see ICE there, that's kind of a traditional combustion engine vehicle. And so the last point there just notes that looking at those planned replacements over time, all traditional internal combustion engine vehicles cannot be converted in a 10-year time frame. So we just wanted to acknowledge that there in that bullet point. And the graphic at the bottom shows kind of the our how we came up with a number and type of electric vehicles to be replaced in a year. So we worked within the city's current model for vehicle replacements. We looked at trends in the industry related to electric vehicle pricing and technology. We did assume some financial constraints in some of the scenarios that I'll show here, as well as coming up with some priority goals or objectives for converting to an electric vehicle fleet. And I'll show that here. There are 6 scenarios that we presented on this slide here and in our report. And so with the data that we had, we created these multiple scenarios through the use of an optimization model that calculated a recommended number of electric vehicles for each objective. And these objectives also allow for some discussion on what is most important to the city when it comes to converting to electric vehicles. For example, is it most important to maximize the reduction in carbon dioxide emissions? If so, scenario 1 kind of reflects that without any financial constraints. While scenario 2 does add a financial constraint of $5 million above what the city would normally spend in each year along our 10-year time frame. So our optimization model allowed us to kind of set those as objectives and see what the optimal number of electric vehicles would be across those different categories that Brett had presented earlier. So scenarios 3 through 6, I'll kind of read them here. Scenario 3 was maximizing a net present value, again with that $5 million financial constraint. Scenario 4 was maximizing total benefits. That was fuel, maintenance, and carbon dioxide reductions. Scenario 5 was maximizing the total number of electric vehicles purchased. In scenario 6, the last one there, is again maximizing net present value while delaying purchasing for 2 years, which would allow the city to save some funds now to make a purchase of electric vehicles in 2020. The results of our optimization model showed that scenario 3 and 6 were identical, actually. So our next slides will present those two together. And at the bottom are some key considerations among all the scenarios. Through our research, we found that there would not be any SUV or minivan vehicles as electric vehicles that could be considered for the city until about 2020, and no heavy-duty vehicle, heavy construction vehicle, or light construction vehicles as an electric model until 2022. So our next slides here are much more graphical in nature here. This first slide is illustrating the total costs by year over the 10-year time frame. And the business as usual case is on the left side of that black line there. That is continuing, that is the total operations and maintenance and capital cost by year for just purchasing traditional vehicles over that time frame. So our scenarios to the right of that show a combination of purchasing those traditional vehicles and electric vehicle replacements that we had recommended in each of our scenarios. So you can see a slight increase there amongst the scenarios compared to a business as usual, but it's not as drastic as it might appear. The next slide here shows the total number of electric vehicles that came out of our optimization model. Scenario 1 on the far left there shows the total quantity on the left axis there with a percentage of the total vehicle fleet. So when we say scenario 1 there has 456 vehicles, that's over a 10-year time frame, representing 45% of the city's fleet over the course of 10 years. And you'll see scenarios 2, 3, and 6 again in the middle, and scenarios 4 and 5. And just as a recap, scenario 1 was maximizing carbon dioxide reductions with no financial constraints. Scenario 2 was adding a financial constraint of $5 million above what the city would normally spend. Scenarios 3 and 6 were maximizing net present value. Scenario 4 was maximizing total benefits, and 5 was maximizing the total number of electric vehicles purchased. The next slide here shows the total benefits graphically. This is a combination of maintenance savings, fuel savings, and carbon dioxide reductions that I mentioned earlier. Business as usual is presented on the far left there compared to our scenarios across there. So the blue bar is representing the maintenance savings, the green bar representing the fuel savings, and the line graph going across there represents the carbon dioxide reduction in metric tons of carbon dioxide reduced, I believe. This slide here presents, again, the total costs across that time frame. Business as usual is on the far left there with the blue bars representing total capital costs, the green bar, total operations and maintenance cost, and the line graph at the top there is the sum of those two bars, essentially. So it's similar to the colorful graphic I had presented earlier, but this is just a different look at it here. And this slide here presents a summary of the net present value measure that I talked about earlier, with the blue bar representing a 3% discount rate and the green bar representing a 7% discount rate. This is the net present value over the 10-year life cycle of the study. And so business as usual is on the far left there with our scenarios to the right. And so since it wasn't quite easy to compare left and right, we did add some small bars across the top there, which are representing the difference between our scenarios and the business as usual. So the net present value was indicating that over the course of 10 years, our scenarios were indicating a more favorable net present value than continuing to purchase traditional vehicles over the 10-year time frame of the study. And this last graph here is on cost effectiveness, as I mentioned earlier. This is the cost to save 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide by integrating electric vehicles into the city's fleet for each of the scenarios that we presented in the report. So those scenarios, again, are across the bottom there, and you can see those depicted here with the dollars across the left axis and the scenarios across the bottom there. So to kind of sum up some of the cost considerations going forward, these are some key points to wrap up with respect to that. Electric vehicles typically have lower fuel and maintenance costs than traditional combustion engine vehicles, but a higher upfront capital cost. So over the course of time, the lower maintenance costs are simply the result of fewer moving components within an electric vehicle, and obviously lower fuel costs as well. They don't require any fuel at all. So, another point there's industry consensus that the cost of electric vehicles are trending downward as production volumes will increase over time and battery costs will decrease over time as well. Fuel economy estimates there, EVs typically achieve better fuel economy and also have lower fuel costs than similar internal combustion engine vehicles. And lastly, the cost per kilowatt hour of electricity tends to be lower and more stable than the cost per gallon of gasoline, diesel, or biodiesel there. And some other cost considerations to bring up here. As I noted, an electric vehicle does have less moving parts, and hence the lower maintenance cost over time. Over 5 years, this next point kind of illustrates that electric vehicles can save an average of 35% on maintenance compared to traditional internal combustion engine vehicles. Some other charging infrastructure considerations that we considered. I should mention the total cost I presented earlier did include charging stations throughout the city to support those electric vehicles. So the point to make here is to plan ahead and install more stations upfront than you believe you would need, simply because it's more cost effective to do that with underground conduit to provide power cables for those stations, and you can add those stations on over time. We did assume a 1-to-1 ratio of electric vehicles to charging stations so that all vehicles could be charged adequately overnight. And another point is to plan ahead for recharging during off-peak periods, which can add up to dollars in savings over an overnight period. And it could include also a special tariff from power suppliers for usage during off-peak hours. And this last graph here is just an illustration of the environmental benefits, with the blue bars representing traditional internal combustion engine vehicles and the green bar representing the electric vehicles we had recommended over our 10-year period. And the percentages there are reflected across the top of each bar there. So this is across those vehicle types that Brett had presented on earlier in the presentation. So you can see there are, over 10 years, those benefits do add up for a reduction in carbon dioxide emissions per vehicle. And the last slide here, these are just considerations to think of going forward. Monitoring electric vehicle usage during winter months. The city will monitor that with the Chevy Bolts they have in the fleet just to see how they operate during winter times when vehicle heaters are used more extensively, to see how the range of that vehicle lasts throughout the winter. Also monitor potential sources of funding for electric vehicle purchases. There are several sources that can provide rebates for electric vehicle purchases up front, so that's one thing to monitor, as well as industry progress with electric vehicles. There is a lot of progress being made now, so that's another thing to monitor over the long term. And then review the vehicle replacement approach for new EV models. So this is just reviewing how new electric vehicles can be brought into the current vehicle replacement model over time. And also prepare for infrastructure and maintenance staff for electric vehicle operations. It is a different vehicle, so it does require a different set of training to understand how to maintain an electric vehicle. So that is something to consider as well. And with that, that is the end of our presentation here. So we'll open it up for questions.
Any questions per the presentation? Councilmember Gordon.
A lot of information here. And I just want to clarify that when we talk about the fleet, we're talking about every vehicle that the city owns. That would include the police department, regulatory services, fire department, all public works.
We did, Councilmember Reich and Member Gordon, we did gather vehicle replacement data from the city's Fleet Services Division to understand how many vehicles were being replaced over a 2018 to 2027 time period. So we looked at the replacement years of the vehicles coming up to kind of understand how our recommendations for replacements could fit within the current vehicle replacement model that the city utilizes.
And
Mr.
so when
Chair,
we-
Councilmember, I'll provide just a bit of assistance. This is fleet services that serve the entire city enterprise for all departments of the city, including fire, police, regulatory services, all of the vehicle needs of the city.
And so when we talk about the different scenarios and we say 45% replacement, or we have numbers of 458 vehicles, we should assume that most of those in the scenarios would be the sedans or maybe the minivans or the smaller vehicles, and that I'm actually not clear on how long it takes for us to replace 100% of our vehicles, which is something I'm curious about. And it seems like if we were going to transition, we'd want to look at when we're expecting to buy the new vehicle, and when the one we have now would wear out. It seems like it would be, I suppose we could sell our vehicles early and see if we could recoup some costs, but I think we probably have a trajectory. So would you say most of those replacements are the smaller vehicles?
The number you said there, the 45% under scenario 1, for example, it's a combination of smaller sedan type vehicles, but it also reflects other vehicles in the fleet as well. So it's not entirely in the sedan vehicle category. There are over the future there will be some light duty construction vehicles and heavy duty construction vehicles that come onto the market. So through our research that we did early on in the report, we did find years in which those vehicles could be replaced as well. So it does not include mostly sedans specifically. So.
Okay. And I also was curious, out of the different scenarios, when I was trying to look at this and read it, it seemed pretty clear that scenario 1, 4, and 5 seem to be hitting most of the sweet spots that I would be looking for in terms of benefits, maintenance savings, fuel savings, and CO2 reductions. Is there a scenario that you were settling on as it seemed to be the best that you would recommend we move forward on?
Well, that was early on, before we ever got to developing scenarios for the study. We were kind of wrestling with what should be the best approach, or what should be the ideal approach we go with, and that's where we eventually got to defining some of those objectives. And so we allowed for some discussion there to take place with regards to what is most important to the city. If it's maximizing carbon dioxide reduction emissions, that's scenario 1, as you noted, and that's without any financial constraint that we introduced into the model. So that offers the scenario 1 and scenario 5 obviously offer the most vehicles to be introduced into the fleet. So that right there will help achieve that overall objective there on the study. So it's just it's a good approach to electric vehicle replacement, but it's also acknowledging that there aren't any financial constraints on it. So I mean, that's something to consider in the future, is what will the cost of those vehicles be over time. So I don't know if I have a best recommendation on the scenario, but it's certainly something to discuss within the city on how to move forward with it best. So.
Okay, I also noticed that I think this fall we just put out a bid for a number of new vehicles, and it looked like in those bids we weren't asking for electric vehicles or comparing costs for electric vehicles. And I'm just curious if I could hear a little bit more about, and you don't know about this, but somebody else probably does, and why we're not putting out bids for electric vehicles now to replace them. It looked like a lot of them were the sedans. I think it was the Malibus, and I forget the other kind, but Escape maybe.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Gordon, thanks for that question. We have had a couple bids go out, Malibus and Ford Escapes. The Ford Escape's an easy answer that I can provide for you, and I may call on Brett Jelly and also on John Scharfbill to give you a slightly more technical answer on the Malibus. The Escapes, it's a market issue. There isn't a vehicle that's an SUV vehicle that's made on the market that fits our needs at this time. We think that's going to change rapidly, and the study sort of highlighting how we can look ahead to that. The Malibu's a bit more technical, and either Brett or John can help answer that question.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Gordon, two issues, hybrids, and then you also mentioned we're not putting out bids for the electric vehicles. On the hybrids with the Chevy Malibus, it sometimes they depends on what they're being used for and whether or not they meet the specifications of the end user and whether or not a hybrid is an option. So that is something that we factor in, and in this particular case, hybrids won't meet the specifications of the user. On generally the why not electric vehicles, as I mentioned earlier, I'm personally, if it's not obvious, I think the Chevy Bolt is a really exciting opportunity, but we just got our first 3 this summer, and we definitely, on the things, what are we doing to prepare for electric vehicles? I think one of the things we are doing is we are trying to use these Bolts as much as possible. We have them in a couple of different areas in the city. We especially want to see how they function over the winter. Again, keeping in mind the usability and practicality of our business needs, and also with how our fleet model is built and funding replacements, that is something that we will have the opportunity to kind of start planning for this switchover. We're just not ready today.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate this and appreciate the discussion. And obviously, I want to move forward as aggressively as we possibly can on all of this. And I think it's really important from the policy standpoint. It's exciting to see that the different scenarios play out fairly well, and that the cost differences, even when we don't seem that dramatic. I know that when they add up over the years, they are. It costs a little bit more, and it's in the millions of dollars over those years, but doing nothing is almost as much as doing the best scenario. So that's kind of promising, and hopefully we'll have some ideas about how to hone in on the study so that we can come back with a better recommendation and direction from the council.
Thank you. Councilmember Glidden?
Thank you. I wanted to make sure I kind of brought up something that I'm sure others may bring up, so I might as well kind of now, which is that this was more of an evaluation of the both the cost and then the environmental benefits of various scenarios. And I am sure that somewhere, somehow into the conversation will also come questions about kind of where the industry is alongside with what are the performance needs of the variety of vehicles in the city of Minneapolis. And so how does that feed into the criteria that we we'll be looking at, knowing again, I guess I will say, as you point out in your report, that this is an evolving industry. So just as an example, you know, we often have conversation about police vehicles, right? Which are heavily used, which have a lot of like stuff stuck in them, and you know, and all this kind of thing. And also, in addition to just what is the performance data, there are also perceptions. So you know. So anyway, I just am curious how, from a fleet perspective, that kind of data gets added in to kind of help with the analysis and thinking through schedules of replacement and all that. And I mean, I say too, for kind of, I have no idea what this looks like for kind of the bigger vehicles and how that relates to performance. And
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Glidden, that's a really good set of questions. And earlier in the presentation, I mentioned this kind of connection of meeting our business needs out in the field and doing the work we need to do, as well as the drivers who are in those vehicles and meeting the needs of from their day-to-day perspective, in addition to the environmental benefits and all the other things that go along with converting over to electric vehicles. One of the things AECOM did early in their study is they sat down with, I think there's in the appendix, there's a list of departments they sat down with to start this conversation around, you know, what are generally your needs, what's important to you, Again, a Chevy Bolt, it has some advantages. It sits a little bit higher, which is something that comes up a lot with our employees, and the ease of getting in and out and kind of wear and tear on people who get in and out of their vehicles a lot. Also quite a bit of interior space. So having these 3 bolts, and I'm kind of personally pushing this in every conversation I have with departments. Do you know we have these 3 vehicles? And please talk to John if you want to try them out. So I think Property Services has signed up for a week in one to try it out, really trying to work that side of the problem, because you're right. As I said, any particular vehicle, for it to be successful, we need to understand and meet the needs of our employees.
So are we going to see kind of something separate that comes to us to kind of just help us understand that process? Because I think that at some point this is going to come back, and then we'll adopt some policy. I guess I'm looking at the chair, and and then this will be some, so for that to be successful, I think we need to understand that other piece, I'm assuming. And I guess I'm looking to you a little bit, or you and your team, to kind of help us understand how those things add in, because, to set the policy, I think we want to make sure we've got the right set of information, knowing that often there are, in addition, there's culture things within the city to kind of continue to work out and all of that. So,
And perhaps just kind of an extension of that thought, instead of maybe, passively offering different departments to check it out, maybe we make it more of a directive. We need some field information that's germane to the employees, and we need that information sooner than later.
thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that's, again, I think we need to figure out how directly, what's the direction that helps get the information that allows us to set a policy and make sure that we kind of are doing that in recognition of kind of all these factors that feed into vehicle choice and direction from the policymakers and staff on the restrictions around that choice.
Very well put. We are joined by the co-author of this directive, Councilmember Andrew Johnson. You can have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for you on these results. One of the things I appreciate so much about the report is the level of technical depth to it. But would you be able to, on these strategies for EV transition, it looks like over business as usual, scenario 1 would yield a change in net present value of $600,000 over 10 years. So if I'm reading that right, it sounds like switching over under that scenario, 45% of our fleet yields actually a benefit of $600,000 to the city. Am I reading that right? Can you put that in layman's terms for anybody watching? What does that mean? Are we seeing a brighter future, both from an electrical vehicle standpoint and a cost standpoint, or rather a net present value standpoint?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, I am going to use my net present value lifeline and bring Dan Nelson back up here.
Councilmember Rake. Council members, yes, that is a correct interpretation when you look at that value of 0.6 million is what reflects the $600,000 value there. That is for scenario 1, we'll refer to it as a positive difference between business as usual, which is continuing to purchase the same vehicles over the next 10 years, compared to that 45% of electric vehicles being adopted into the fleet. So that is a more favorable investment over the 10-year life cycle compared to an investment in the same traditional internal combustion engine vehicles. So that is how you can interpret that with a 3% discount rate that we used. And for the other scenarios, you can see how that looks as well in that same figure there. So,
well, that's wonderful, and that's one of the, I think, the biggest pieces of this finding. I think we all had the assumption electric vehicles are we've heard anecdotally, oh, they're so great at reducing fuel costs and this and that, but I hope that other cities across our state really take note of this study, that you actually are going to see a better value at the end of the day over 10 years if you're switching over effectively half your fleet, in this case, to electric vehicles. I think that's a really exciting finding of this work. And I really want to thank staff for their time and energy into this. It's just great results from it, and a really comprehensive report. I want to thank my co-author, Chair Reich, for the work on this, and I hope that we can, and I look forward to working on trying to put forward some policy guidance and set something in stone, some real goals around this. And if anything, what this tells me is if we can get 45% of our fleet over and see this net present value, maybe we can stretch a little further even and try to be even a little more aggressive beyond the 45%. That's my personal hope, that over 10 years we can do even more to move our vehicle fleet over. And so thanks again. This is really exciting stuff.
Any further questions or comments? I think I can echo the appreciation of the work that's been done. We were always eager to reduce our footprint, even from the original policy, and we saw progress. But now we took an opportunity to take our readiness and aim with good policy framework that I think has been provided. Obviously, as Councilmember Glidden pointed out, we want to get some of that real human aspect of it, and that's some field testing. And hopefully we can be a little more aggressive on that front to get the data sets in. And to Councilmember Gordon and I believe Councilmember Johnson's point that kind of was a thread throughout, we can be at the edge of technological advances if we start to get into the game now. And then to the point of getting even beyond 45%, as if we're in that game and we're always on the cutting edge, we're always doing the analysis and we're sort of there, I think that's where we'll find acceleration. We might even beat our goals, even on the more aggressive end. But that time will tell. But I think if you're not in that framework, you certainly would not, you'd be doing catch up instead of being a leader in this area. And I think this presents us as a leader in this area if we follow through on what we have before us as a framework. So with that end, I will move to receive and file the presentation relating to the electric vehicle study, noting the eagerness of this committee and probably the body as a whole on council to move forward expeditiously to get these gains that we have before us. With that, all in favor, say aye. Aye. Dissenting nay. That carries. We can now move to the last item on our agenda, which is item 11, the contract amendment with Clear Night Group, LLC, for communication public relations services for the Nicollet Mall reconstruction project. Director Hutchinson.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, this item was referred back by the City Council last week to this committee here. I have a short update report to tell you that we will be working very closely with our internal communications department to better refine the work that will be completed by our in-house staff, and the work that would be completed by our external consultant will be back to you with a revised proposal on November 13th, and we'll provide you with additional detail at that time.
Thank you. And so I will then move item 11, which was returned to the TPW committee by City Council on October 20th, 2017. And direction was given to staff at that time to work with the communications department to examine options to reduce the amount of external contracting as necessary. So we will note that extension of our action. With that, we have concluded all our items on the agenda and are thereby adjourned. Thank you.